Well, greeting, lay missioners. I trust you are well. Today, I want to provide a lecture for you on the era that basically centers upon Puritanism. It's about a 100-year period. The Puritans did not rule England entirely during this time. There is a period of about 20 years that they do rule and control England in the latter portion of this time frame. But what this illustrates is really how dynamic the period following the Reformation was. There were wars of religions on the continent, but there's also civil wars going on in Great Britain at the time, and conflict between various religious parties. Initially, it was Catholic and Anglican Church of England, and then as you move through time, it's the Church of England versus Puritanism, with Roman Catholicism still struggling on the side. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the subject of theocracy and how the concept of the era of the time, the combination of these ideas with political and religious thought, seeking to develop a theocratic kingdom, was somewhat, or republic, as with Puritans, was really a strong impulse, and in many senses created dissent, created persecution, created a context where there was a lot of struggle for diverse people groups to engage one another well in a healthy society. So we'll talk about those items. I'll pause just for a moment and then I will share with you my screen. The time frame we're talking about is overlaps with Elizabeth's reign. It starts in 1564 and it goes all the way to 1660. So we're talking about a century of time of struggle between the monarchy and Parliament. And we call this the era of Puritanism because this is a primary word that's being developed in this time frame. I can relate it very easily to perhaps the Pharisees of the early period, not to say the Puritans are Pharisees, but there's always this impulse within religion to have the pure faith. And the Puritans felt like they were the pure ones, as did the Essenes. They withdrew from the temple back in the first century, and they considered themselves the pure ones and would have nothing to do with the desecrated temple. And so you have this pure impulse, a pure faith. And the Puritans really desired to go back to a very pure Christian faith. They're very strong Paulinist, as in terms of Paul, the apostle, and some of his views on election. And so you have a very interesting dynamic developing here. In 1564, we have this date is because that's the first time that the word actually appears in print, and this word Puritan. They were Calvinists, centering out of Geneva with great influence by John Calvin and his followers. They're very staunchly conservative, want to conserve the Christian faith, especially going back to the first century and some of the dynamics of that time period with elder rule. They're very much anti-monarchy. They do not like the king. They do not like the monarchy. They're anti-Catholic, and they're anti-Church of England to the extent that the Church of England represents some of the vestiges of Catholicism in English society. And they took a very rigorous approach to biblical interpretation, basically making the rule that only what the Bible positively advocates is to be practiced in the church and in society. And so what do they want? They want a skilled and educated preaching ministry based on the Bible. They wanted people who exposited the scripture, and you can hear an impulse that fits in with evangelicals here as well. They wanted very few ceremonies in the church, as few as biblically possible. And they wanted to do away with all of the vestiges that would relate to Catholicism. So no surplice, which would be a sort of a covering that priests would wear when they're celebrating the Eucharist. No sign of the cross, no candles. And so a lot of times when Puritans would take over churches, they would whitewash the buildings. They would remove all the icons. And so it's almost like an iconoclast controversy again, struggle between Church of England retaining some of those things. Their approach to interpretation was to allow whatever the Bible does not prohibit. And whereas on the other hand, Puritans would say only what the Bible advocates is allowed. And so there's a contrast between their approach. They wanted to abolish the traditional role of the bishop and replace the bishop or the episcopacy. Episkopos is the word for bishop with a Presbyterian system modeled by John Calvin in Geneva. And this goes back to elder rule that they see as very prominent in the New Testament. Congregations would be ruled by a commission that was 2/3 laymen who were elected annually, and 1/3 clergy who were elected for life. And that was the rule of the city, not just of the church itself, but the city. And again, I mentioned as I started the lecture that there's an impulse of theocracy. And what John Calvin and the Council in Geneva wanted to accomplish was sort of a theocratic community. And that impulse is present there, even in their organizational structure. It's not just how to organize the church, it's how to organize society. And they wanted one legal governmental church controlled by the Puritans, in contrast with the separatists, which would be Baptists, Quakers, and others who had a sense and desire for separation of church and state. So as you can hear what's going on here, there are a lot of dynamics in different views of how religion should work. You had Catholic perspectives, you have Church of England perspectives, and then you have Puritan perspectives. And then outside of them, you have Quakers, you have Baptists, you have various separatistic, non-conforming groups that didn't prefer any one of the three major ones. So let's look at this period and go through the chronology here. Again, I'll point out to you that what I've done in these notes is I've gone through, and if you can see the blue lettering, that's where I have a link to an article. Sometimes these articles are produced by Anglican leaders like James Kiefer, maybe a certain review, or it could be a Wikipedia article or some other document that leads you to further study in case you want to follow up on these individuals and give greater consideration to them. Thomas Cartwright, I guess in my mind, as I understand it, Cambridge University was a place where the Puritans really had a stronghold. And Thomas Cartwright, who was of Cambridge, he outlined the Puritan or the Presbyterian program. Presbytery basically means elder and ruled by elders. And so the Puritans fit in with a Presbyterian model. And Presbyterians come from the Puritan program that really begins in Geneva. He had strong sympathy with the admonition to Parliament, which was a document that really was anti-monarchy and anti-Church of England, and showed that he was very much in opposition. So there's some political rivalry and religious rivalry going on here. He's credited with systematizing and advocating for the Puritan reform of the Church of England. And so Cartwright is a significant individual and really gets this movement underway in its early impulses in the 1560s. In 1571, John Jewel dies. Now, he's a significant theologian, and David Holmes, whose book on the Anglican Episcopal Church, I've cited to you before. I don't have the exact title with me here. He identifies three individuals as being the theologians of the Elizabethan settlement. If you remember the Elizabethan settlement, it was the way that really the Church of England defined itself as being Catholic in many of its forms, but also Protestant in many of its theological perspectives, and reforming the Book of Common Prayer, the 39 Articles, and various attitudes of toleration in the period, and setting up this via media that was there. And there are three theologians that he identifies: John Jewel, William Perkins, and Richard Hooker. Hooker's probably the one you might know of the most. Jewel wrote an apology for the Church of England, and basically he defended the Church of England against Roman Catholicism. That is his foil that he's writing against, is the Catholic Church. And what he used was biblical and patristic materials of the earliest periods to defend that the Church of England had a right to reform itself and conform itself to the primitive church of the ancient fathers and apostles. And he felt like that many of the developments that occurred in the Roman Catholic Church during the medieval period were illegitimate, as did many of the Protestant reformers of the period. And he made the challenge and pledge that he would become a Roman Catholic if anyone could show him from the earliest resources of the Bible and patristic literature that papal doctrine, for example, that the Bishop of Rome is head of the Universal Catholic Church. If they could show from these early documents, the New Testament and early patristic writings, that this was a true doctrine that was held by them, then he would convert back to Catholicism. And he died, obviously a member of the Church of England. No one could show him that in the earliest period. And this claim was not made. I actually, one time was sitting at a meal with my son, and I went to the North American Patristic Society meeting, and I was getting ready to go take my son to have some Chicago-style pizza. And as we were talking to the person at the hotel about where to go, an individual walked up and said he was looking for the same thing. And I said, would you like to dine with my son and I? And he said, well, that'd be great, but I've got a friend coming. And it ended up being my son and I. I was a professor at a university at the time, and not an Anglican yet. So my son and I were evangelicals, low church evangelicals, and we're sitting at this meal with a Roman Catholic retired priest and a Eastern Orthodox cantor, someone who led the liturgy in an Eastern Orthodox church. And we had the most marvelous discussions. But I asked this priest for my own historical studies, 2nd century, 3rd century studies, do you really believe that Peter was in a position of being Bishop of Rome, the first Bishop of Rome? He said, oh no. And so even him, who was part of the Roman Catholic Church, would say that Peter was not, didn't occupy the title of Bishop of Rome. And I think that's pretty much historically accurate. And so here's Jewel, who's challenging that and setting up, okay, the Church of England needed to reform, and it's actually probably more truthful to the early church than Roman Catholicism was in its day. 1575, the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was translated, and it becomes a very popular edition of the Bible, quite inexpensive. It was printed with the printing press, and one of the first to be offered in this way. I think it was actually completely translated by 1560, but didn't get printed and published until 1575. And this became the very popular Bible of the Puritan movement, and the Bible of the Mayflower Pilgrims that they took with them. Some people think that the Mayflower Pilgrims had the King James Version, but they did not. And they would hold to the Geneva Bible, which was very dynamic, a dynamic edition of the Bible, and probably a better translation than some of the other ones available at the time. 1581, you have Robert Brown writing a treatise of Reformation without tarrying for any. And this is an important treatise that is, again, sort of a manifesto of the Puritans, and it became a manifesto of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and some of the resistance they have to monarchy, to Catholicism, and to the Church of England. We come to our second great theologian here in 1581. This date, 1581, is the date of Richard Hooker being ordained a priest. I've given you two links here. One is a little biography of Richard Hooker himself, but the other link is even to his famous work. His most famous written work was a Treatise of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, excuse me. And what he was doing in that work, he was using natural law and rationalistic ideas to justify what the existence of the church and the state should be, and what their organizational structure should be. And he would basically say that all positive laws of church and state are developed from three primary pillars. One is scripture revelation. He was very, very much focused on the Bible. Ancient tradition. He legitimized the tradition of the church, except where it went awry in the medieval period. And he accepted human reason. And these three things become the source of our development of Christian theology and our praxis and understanding of church and state. This perspective gave Anglicanism a theological method. That's David Holmes' concept. And I think in a sense it's true. There are three pillars that we build our truth upon: scripture, tradition, and human reason. John Wesley will come along a little bit later, and the major compiler of his works would argue that he would add a fourth element, and that fourth element would be human experience. And for both Hooker and for Wesley, they would give primacy to scriptural revelation. The Bible is the most crucial determiner of truth for us. But that's not to say that tradition is not important. As a matter of fact, without tradition, without the development of understanding within the church itself, you really wouldn't have a scriptural canon. The canon was not devised until the 4th century. And who devised the canon? It was bishops using the rule of faith, the development of doctrine, to measure the books by, to determine which one should be in the New Testament and which one should be, although in the Jewish scriptures themselves, as the Jews, the rabbis had made that determination. And so you have a methodology developing here. And he's such a charitable writer that Pope Clement VIII, who was Pope at the time, stated that the laws, the treatise of the laws of ecclesiastical polity, contain the seeds of eternity. And he's recognizing Hooker to be a very charitable individual. Hooker countered both English Puritanism and Catholicism. So as you find Jewell writing primarily against Catholicism, Hooker is really paving a way between these two. And he's advocating, probably one of the most important advocates of what we call the via media, the middle way. He opposed Catholicism only insofar that it was an error. He wasn't trying to throw out the entirety of Catholicism, as the Puritans really were attempting to do. And he stated that the episcopacy existed for the good of the church. It's needed, it's necessary, it's important, but it is not its essence. Catholicism would say the episcopacy is the essence of the church. It's rooted in these individuals who are the successors to the apostles, and that's how they understand apostolic church. Hooker contributed to the Book of Homilies. If you go to your 39 articles, what you're going to see in there are several books of homilies that are mentioned, and there are even titles of homilies mentioned within the 39 articles themselves. And these books of homilies were written, Hooker wrote some, Cranmer wrote some, I think Lancelot Andrewes wrote some as well, but they were written so that priests who did not have a lot of training, perhaps at the time, could take those homilies and read them periodically in their churches so that their people would get a good sermon. And Hooker was most famous for one that he wrote on justification by faith and what exactly that means. And what Hooker contended was that, sometimes we as theologians get very uptight about specifics of words and stating it accurately. And if you don't state it accurately, you're going to hell, the type of concept. And so what Hooker wrote in his book was this: God is no captious sophister, eager to trip us up whenever we say whatever we say amiss, but he's a courteous tutor, ready to amend what in our weakness or in our ignorance we say ill, and to make the most of what we say aright. And so he gives this picture of God being most gracious, and he's not looking for us to slam us if we don't say exactly how justification works. He's willing to make the best of what we have said aright, and he's willing to forbear even our ignorance. And so he would say Catholics are going to heaven. They're not just all going to hell, as some people at the time might have been willing to say. So Hooker is just a great leader for the church, one of our what we would call Anglican divines. This is a time of great literature, and you'll notice that some of the great names of literature show up here. William Shakespeare is writing in the 1590s. He's a famous English playwright. He actually, in his writings, ridicules some of the Puritans, and so that's why we mention him here in his characterizations of Falstaff and Malvolio, Flavius, and others, and they show up in his writings almost in a sense of mockery. 1593, Puritans' assemblies and activities were outlawed by Elizabeth. There were starting to be more contention going on in English society. And some of the separatists, not Puritans, but separatists, probably some of the Baptists, some of the Anabaptist groups were hanged. Some of the statements of the 42 articles, which predated the 39 articles, were very severe in talking about some of these separatistic groups, these nonconformist groups, and because they were agitating quite a bit. And so you have religious persecution all the way to the point of execution. The third theologian in 1597 is William Perkins, and he published Reformed Catholic, one of his works. It's a defense of his own position as a Puritan Anglican. And so here's someone who sort of combines that Reformed uh, five-point Calvinism that was being built in on Calvin's system, and he's also still an Anglican priest. And so he reveals that a strong Calvinist with an antipathy, a dislike for medieval ritualism, could remain committed to the Church of England. He still supported, although I think the language of Holmes' book is that he tolerated the episcopacy, but he saw it as something useful, and he remained within the Church of England. Some people look to him as being inspiring the Puritan movement, but he's someone who stayed within. And some of the ways the 39 articles are written are trying to keep people like William Perkins within the movement. And there is a strong Calvinistic strain in there. 1603, Elizabeth I is succeeded by James I. James was already ruler, King of Scotland. He'd been that from the age of 13 months. He was James IV of Scotland, and he started reigning there in 1567. And then he was of the lineage that he was also became King of England and Ireland as James I. So he occupied those two titles, James I of Ireland and England, and James IV. So he's the same person with those titles. And he rules from 1603 to 1627. He's a son of Mary, Queen of Scots. He was an advocate for peace. He was quite diplomatic. He sought to involvement in religious wars, although it was very hard to escape that in that time, but he avoided the wars of the continent involving England in them, the 30 Years' War that was so devastating in Germany. Literature flourished during what is called the Jacobean era after his name James, and he sponsored the King James Version of the Bible. So the King James Bible comes from James I of England. He faced opposition from a variety of directions, including the gunpowder plot, and that's mentioned a little bit below. And this is a Roman Catholic attempt to overthrow the Church of England and to reestablish a Catholic monarch in England. And he was caricatured by some as the wisest fool in Christendom. So he's an author. He's a person who promotes literature, but in some ways people thought he was quite naive or even foolish in terms of a leader. The Mayflower Pilgrims leave England for the United States during his reign. So you know that things are not at peace, that the Puritans are agitated underneath his rule. And so this era is still a lot of controversy here, a lot of struggle going on in this period. 1604, there's a revision of the Book of Common Prayer. It's not a major revision. It expanded the catechism. The sacraments were defined as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, which is the language that we use for how we define a sacrament. At the Eucharist, it says that the body and blood of Christ are verily and indeed taken and received by the faithful. Now, there's a little bit of vagueness here, but it does indicate that there's a sense of real presence of Christ in the bread and the wine. 1605, you have the gunpowder plot, which I mentioned just a moment ago. Roman Catholic fanatics seeking to blow up Parliament and reestablish a Catholic monarchy in England. Guy Fawkes was arrested when they found him with a number of barrels of gunpowder, and enough to blow up a large portion of the Parliament city and that region of the city. And 7 others, conspirators, they were hanged and drawn and quartered pretty severe in 1606 after their trial. But he was imprisoned in 1605. So a very interesting period here of controversy. So it's not just Church of England and Puritans struggling, but also Catholics are still struggling on the side as well, until you get to a place where there's more toleration in the culture. 1605 is also the time when Lancelot Andrewes, a very important theologian of the Anglican movement, he became Bishop of Chichester in 1605 and Winchester in 1619. So he has 2 very important bishoprics. He's very scholarly. He knows over 20 languages in terms of his expertise. His sermons were very scholarly, but and for some it might have been too academic, but yet he was also very popular. People enjoyed listening to him. And he was on the committee of scholars who produced the King James Version of the Bible. So he is one of the, I think, one of the most important translators at that time, even though a lot of the language of the King James Version comes from the Tyndale Bible. His written prayers are used for devotion and liturgy, and some of them I think are included in our Book of Common Prayer. And so Lancelot Andros is another theologian who's very significant during this time frame. 1611, I mentioned, is the King James Version of the Bible. Is completed. It becomes the most popular Bible of the church, of the English-speaking church. Not of the Puritans necessarily. I'll tell you a quick story. I was, one of my first positions out of seminary was at a Bible college in Boston, Massachusetts. And one of my colleague friends, he was a pastor, he was not a professor, but he went down to Plymouth Plantation. And Plymouth Plantation is a place where they celebrate the Pilgrims, and they celebrate the Mayflower and the people who came over and settled in Plymouth, but they act in character as if they live in, I think, 1627, and they don't acknowledge anything after it. So if you mention something that happened in 1680, they would act like they don't know anything about it. So they're trained very well. And one of my friends was there kind of harassing a little bit, and he was asking this young lady some questions, and he was asking her about the King James Version. He said, "Did you use the King James Version?" And because he was a King James only, that little movement I was a part of held to the King James as being the only legitimate translation, English translation of the Bible. All others were of Satan. And so he's asking her about this, and he said, "Did you use the King James Version?" And she said, "Oh no, we would have nothing to do with that new translation." And, "Well, what Bible did you use?" "The Geneva Bible." And he started harassing her, and people started to gather around as he was questioning her, and she began to question him. And finally she looks at him and says, "Sir, what dost thou do?" And he said, "Well, I'm a preacher." And she says, "Well, you're a preacher. Ah, you're a preacher. Then thou knowest Hebrew." And he said, "No, I don't know Hebrew." "Then thou knowest Greek." And, "No, I don't know Greek." And then certainly thou knowest Latin. And he said, "No, I don't know Latin." And then she shook her head to the great joy of the crowd and says, "Thou art not a preacher." And so you have this sense of elevated scholarship and then attitudes towards King James Version. Just sort of illustrates some of the attitudes that even sustain to this day in terms of some groups. And much to my gladness to be gone from that background, that was part of my past. 1618, you have James I, Declaration of Sports. The Puritans were making all kinds of rules and design and agitated for all kinds of things to not do anything on Sunday. If you know, in New England, we had what was called blue laws, and some of those were related to Puritan background about not doing anything on Sunday. Stores were not to be open on Sunday. All kinds of different rules about this. And James declares that, he writes this document, a treatise, that says is to be read in all the churches, that encouraged healthy fun and games on Sunday. And it just outrages the Puritans who felt like Sunday should be this austere day. The church I pastored had sort of a Puritan influence. It had been a Presbyterian church, and they still talked about Sunday as being the Sabbath, and Sabbath rules were supposed to apply that day. 1622, you have John Donne. He's a poet, he's a priest, he's a metaphysical poet. He becomes Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is one of the most prominent churches in London. If you've been there, it's a beautiful sanctuary built by, and it's rebuilding by Christopher Wren. Initially, he was an individual who sought a vocation in government, and he abandoned that pursuit because he eloped with a 16-year-old girl. He was a little bit older at the time, and her father was so upset with him of taking this 16-year-old girl that he was in prison for a period. That sort of derailed his his governmental vocation. And eventually he moves toward the church. He's ordained and becomes a leading priest who is obviously very popular, being the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral and a poet as well. And so some of our literature from John Donne comes from this period. 1625, James dies, and he's succeeded as King of England and Scotland by Charles I. He's James's second son. He's very colorful in his personality, and his court becomes very much filled with people who are coming back. He's again a person of peace. And even some Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation types become part of his court. And so there's a lot of resistance to him, particularly by the Puritans, because they see him as being a Catholic and accuse him of being a Catholic. And he has a lot of struggle with the House of Commons and Parliament. And this ended with a civil war and his beheading in 1649. To his dying day, he remained devoted to the Church of England. And yet, because of some of his alliances, because of some of his policies, the Puritans saw him as being Roman Catholic, and that enraged them. And so, a very interesting individual leading, but obviously put to death. Nicholas Ferrat, this is an interesting little piece of things that shows you some of the things going on in the religious world at the time. He founded a community called Little Gidding. And this was a religious community in Huntingdonshire, England, which was devoted to prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Very simple living, pretty much committed to voluntary poverty. And this was broken up by Cromwell's Puritan army because they wouldn't tolerate this type of sort of a communal society. And so very interesting dynamics going on here. This is not, this religious community is sort of developing sort of I guess you might even call a monastic community, sort of socialistic community where they are living life together in this very simple agrarian community. And I'm sure Farrar had resources that were tucked away for the supporting this community, keeping it going, but they lived a very simple, almost near poverty type of existence. 1628, William Laud, who was Archbishop of London in 1628 and later became Archbishop of Canterbury, he's very narrow-minded, very intolerant towards the Puritans, and he is going to defend the various church customs. Have to have the surplice, have to have the ornaments, have to have all these different things. And he oversaw the persecution of Puritans who opposed them. Some of them were even imprisoned, some perhaps even put to death under his archbishopric. He was accused of treason and held in the Tower of London for 4 years until he was tried and hanged in 1644, 1645 at the age of 71. And he almost becomes a symbol of monarchy and Church of England abuses by the Puritans. 1633, you have George Herbert writing poems, and they are published after his death in a work called The Temple. And he was vigilant in his role as parish priest. He visited the poor and the sick, caring for all types of people. Just an amazing individual and an amazing author of literature. And so there's a link to some of his literature as well as to his biography here. 1633, we also have Jeremy Taylor. He's ordained a priest. He's in this year, he's serving as chaplain to Archbishop Laud and Charles I. So he's very much an insider to the monarchy and to the church. He was imprisoned under Puritan rule. When he got out, he served as bishop in Ireland following the Restoration. The Restoration comes about 1660 after the time of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, the time of the Revolution. And after his time in prison, he was able to go to England and serve as a bishop in Ireland. He authored important devotional literature, and some of these are still appealed to today for people who are looking to have really a holy life, a call to a holy life. And the first one I have mentioned here is The Rule and Exercises of Holy Living. And then his second book, published a year later, was The Rule and Exercise of holy dying. And this is important devotional literature coming from this era. 1637, the Scottish Prayer Book is published. And this is for the Scottish people, but for many in Scotland, it was unpopular. Scotland was a place where Puritanism had taken strong effect, and they had a strong Presbyterian church developing there. And it did call priests presbyters, yet this Scottish prayer book was rejected as being something of the imposition of the Church of England upon the Scottish people, and they would have none of it. And this Scottish prayer book, the Scottish bishops eventually have major influence upon what takes place in the development of the Episcopal Church in the United States, and it becomes a basis for the future American prayer book, where we have in the Church of the Episcopal Church following the Revolutionary War. 1638, the Scots, crying popery, they excommunicated all their bishops, and this results in war. So a war begins in 1638, and the first seeds of the English Civil Wars are developing here. 1640, Charles the First, who was contending with Parliament, at certain times he suspended Parliament, but he had to call them back to approve funds for the war with Scotland. And Parliament came back in their opposition to him. They didn't support his approving of funds. Instead, they raised an army against the king. And so you have the beginning of the struggle of the war. These civil wars are following. Oliver Cromwell is a general. He had been a general in the Royal Army before. Now he's a general in the New Model Army. And they rebel. And he becomes, over time, once the monarchy is killed, he becomes Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1653. And so you have the establishment of the Protectorate. Oliver Cromwell, you can read the article about him. He's a descendant of Thomas Cromwell. Sometimes you can get these two names confused. Thomas Cromwell was Henry VIII's advisor back in the early 1500s, and Oliver Cromwell is a descendant of his who's living in the 1600s. And he has a very interesting legacy as you evaluate him. Some people call him a regicidal dictator, which means he's a dictator who killed off the kings. And other people consider him a hero of liberty, throwing off the yoke of monarchy and throwing off the yoke of the Church of England. And so his people who write about him, he's either a villain or a hero. And he ends up being this person who is either loved or hated. John Milton was very much a supporter of the Puritan cause, and he was his Latin secretary, keeping the records of state. Puritan morality became the law of the land. There were many laws that were passed. One instance I give you is the Adultery Act of 1650, and it imposed the death penalty for anybody who committed adultery. And as far as we know, it was never applied, but it just shows you the intensity with which the Puritans were establishing their rule. And this is reflected in New England a little bit later on with some of the Puritan movement as well. So that's the nature of Oliver Cromwell's Puritan movement and the Protectorate. It's called the Protectorate that he was guiding and ruling over England in the suspension of the monarchy during this era. 1643, the Westminster Assembly, which would be the governmental organ, is drafting the Westminster Confession of Faith. And I give you two links here. One is the link to the story, and the other is the link to the actual text. It's found on Legionnaires' ministry post. And it becomes the major Presbyterian statement of faith, a very important confession of faith for Protestant movements. 1645, William Laud was beheaded by the Puritans. 1649, Cromwell and his government beheaded King Charles I, and he became a martyr for the monarchy, a martyr for the Church of England. Charles II was crowned King of Scotland almost immediately, 1650, and he lived out his reign in exile in France until he was crowned King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1661, with the beginning of the Restoration after the Republic, after Cromwell's Republic and the Protectorate that he'd established. So you got a lot of dynamics going on here, and this time when the Puritans are ruling Great Britain. Last note here, 1649, there's a number of dissenting groups that resist Cromwell and the new Commonwealth and resist the Puritans and resist really the establishment of any religious system in over England. And some of these groups are called, there's three titles here I have for you. The Diggers, who are accused of anarchy. They sought agrarian socialism, basically everybody living off the land and living in this peaceful, perfect society and world. There's a strong, let me correct the misspelling here while I'm here. Whoops, how did that, I'm sorry. That jumped right to the top. Oh, I can't correct it, maybe on this. I'll correct that later. They were accused of anarchy, but really what they were trying to establish was peace. They were trying to establish just the common people living simple agrarian lives, and they were called the Diggers. And obviously these names are names that are pejorative names that are given to them, not necessarily ones that they would advocate for themselves. That's usually how these things work. The Levelers were individuals who were called, they were accused of being egalitarians, who are trying to equalize all people, and they're advocating for individual rights so that nobody could rule over each other's personal views or other things. And they wanted a government by and for the people, not necessarily ruled by the elites or by monarchs or whatever. So it would be against both the monarchy and the republic. And the last group was called the Ranters. The Ranters were oftentimes pantheistic. They did have this sense that the divine was in all things. And so you listen to the divine who's within you to determine what truth is. And many of them were accused of being antinomian, which means against law. And some of them accused of immorality. And sometimes some of these maybe caricatures would picture them as being people who supported nudity and all kinds of bizarre things. That type of a critique of a group that you don't like very often carries with it ideas of sexual immorality. Some of the earliest Christians were accused of sexual immorality by the Roman opponents, and they were accused of incest because they called each other brother and sister, and they'd be married to their brother or sister, and they were accused of cannibalism. So you have some of these extreme accusations, and it helps justify evil treatment of these people, even sometimes extreme treatments, putting people to death, etc. So these groups were targeted by a blasphemy act of 1650, which aimed to suppress all radical religious sects that were somehow resistant to the establishment of Puritan ideals in Great Britain. I conclude with just a note here at the end. I think, and I started this at the beginning, an important dimension is to consider in the politics of this era was the strength of the theocratic impulse in religious and political life. Everybody wanted to establish a theocracy, at least the Catholics, the Church of England, and the Puritans. There were a lot of other groups who were outside those realms who resisted it, and they would be called dissenters. And yet these three impulses, primary impulses vying for control of Great Britain, Catholic, Anglican, and Puritan, led to some dramatic swings in British politics, and they were attended with a strong dissent from these parties, as well as a lot of religious persecution, some even to the point of the death penalty. The separatists, the Baptists, Anabaptist groups, Quakers, others, they rejected theocracy. They were looking for individuals being able to determine their own faith. They held to a church that was not necessarily established by government, but a church that was made up exclusively of believers. And so many of the Baptists would oppose infant baptism because they felt like that was a tool of state and not necessarily a representation of conversion. And Quakers, Baptists, a variety of free thinkers, they were quite few, but they were a strong dissenting voice who was pushed to the margin and very much persecuted. And so many of them also found their way to the New World. Quakers in Pennsylvania, in that region, Baptists in Rhode Island with the First Baptist Church, Roger Williams, and then Puritans being forced out as well, going to New England. And so the New World becomes this place where people are seeking a place of freedom. Catholics even went early because they were being persecuted. And then I'm sure many Church of England folks left during the Puritan era. And so you have this impulse also driving settlement in the New World. So a very interesting period, very dynamic, and yet you have wonderful theology written, wonderful literature written, new translations of the Bible. So it's a very mixed period, but it is a period of struggle, and what becomes how the British basically set things up in the future. You come to a place where there's more toleration and more openness to some of these dissenting voices existing without direct persecution. That's our lecture for today, and I pray God's blessing upon you.